That February morning in Alaska felt like any other patrol at first, yet something in the air told me we were walking toward a discovery that had been hidden for more than 5 decades, something that should have stayed buried forever beneath snow and ice thick enough to hide entire forgotten worlds. My name is Sergeant Marcus Riley of the United States Army, and even after 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, nothing came close to the shock waiting for us beneath Fort Glay that frozen winter. Our team was small and tight. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, leading with her usual sharp calm, then Private Tommy Rodriguez, with eyes trained by his Vietnam veteran grandfather, and Private Jackson Porter, fresh from the cornfields of Iowa, and still amazed every day by the Alaskan mountains. The temperature sat at -37, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass, and even the sun rising on February 15th, 2019, at 8:47 in the morning looked sickly and faint, like the sky itself wanted no part of the day ahead. We were completing a routine perimeter sweep about 8 clicks northwest of base, checking for damage along the fence line and watching for wildlife that wandered too close, since deer and even the occasional polar bear sometimes caused trouble. Rodriguez was 20 meters ahead, taking point and scanning everything with the skill of someone born to track. When he called out, "Sarge, you seeing this?" his voice carried a tension that made the hairs on my neck rise. I trudged toward him through snow that cracked like thin glass under each step, heavier, sharper, and crueler than anything in the lower 48. What he had found was not a normal disturbance in the snow. It was a perfect depression, 20 feet wide, sunken, as though something large and rectangular had been buried, and was finally beginning to collapse under the weight of decades. The edges were too sharp, too clean, too mechanical to be natural. Lieutenant Mitchell stepped beside me and raised her field glasses, her breath fogging in the frigid air. She said it might be a forgotten storage bunker from the Cold War, but her voice carried doubt because the position was wrong and the layout did not match any structure built in that era. Alaska was filled with abandoned radar posts and missile silos from the 1950s and 1960s, but all those locations were cataloged and mapped, and this site did not belong to any of them. I ordered Porter to bring shovels from the Humvee, while Rodriguez radioed base reporting a structural anomaly at grid reference Echo November 74329 and requesting instruction. Porter ran across the snow with that eager energy only a new recruit still holds before the weight of service dulls it. As he moved, I circled the depression, feeling my boots catch on edges hidden beneath the crust. Not rocks, but metal corners, metal ridges, metal outlines. Whatever we were standing on was enormous and intentionally shaped, and the depression stretched even larger than I first thought, nearly 40 feet across. The response from base arrived faster than any of us expected. Too fast. In less than 2 minutes, a voice I did not know ordered us to avoid further investigation, mark the site, and return to base immediately. That alone felt wrong, because command always wanted everything checked, inspected, photographed, and reported, yet this time they wanted distance and urgency. Mitchell gave me a look that mirrored my own confusion, but before either of us spoke, we saw Rodriguez already digging through 2 feet of frozen snow with his shovel, uncovering something heavy and dark beneath. When I knelt beside him, my breath stalled. He had uncovered a steel hatch at least 3 inches thick, painted in the old olive drab of 1950s military equipment, still well preserved thanks to decades under snow. But what stopped me cold was not the hatch itself. It was the markings on it. At first, the symbols looked like ordinary unit numbers and classification codes, but then I recognized Cyrillic letters mixed with English markings, and beneath both sets were equations that twisted the mind. Mathematical strings that bent subtly, as if shifting under the eye, and chemical formulas that seemed to change shape when you blinked. And in the center, in faded red paint that looked disturbingly like dried blood, were the words Station, Echo Joint Protocol, Authorized Personnel Only. Joint Protocol meant one terrifying thing for anyone who knew Cold War history. It meant the United States and the Soviet Union had worked together on something here during a time when both nations were ready to annihilate each other over a single misstep. The Soviets and the Americans had built something together here in the frozen quiet of Alaska, and whatever it was, they hid it so deeply that even modern command wanted nothing to do with it. Porter brushed away more snow and spoke with dread in his young voice. "The locks have been cut recently." He was right. The massive bolts were fresh scored, the metal bright and exposed. Someone had opened this hatch within only a few weeks, and the ice around the edges had not fully reformed. I knew then that we should have walked away, followed orders, returned to base, and forgotten the discovery, but instinct built from years of combat told me the opposite. Something dangerous was inside. Something current, something active. I told Mitchell to keep trying to reach base and ordered Rodriguez and Porter to help me open the hatch. The metal hinges groaned like something ancient awakening as we pulled it free, and warm, fresh air surged from below, carrying with it the hum of machines, the rhythm of generators, and faint whispers, almost human voices drifting up from the darkness. I raised my light down the ladder shaft and saw a tunnel descending 150 feet into reinforced concrete walls that glistened with moisture despite the freezing hell above. Then Mitchell radioed for backup, reporting a code yellow security breach in an undocumented facility. But before command could answer, a new voice cut through the static. A frantic Russian voice, shouting orders, gunfire, screaming, and something deeper, something unnatural breaking through their final words. "Seal the lower levels, they are through." Then silence. The radio crackled again after that terrifying Russian transmission, but the voice that followed was not in any language I recognized. It was not English and not Russian and not anything I had ever heard a human speak. Yet the meaning cut straight into my mind, as if the words had bypassed sound entirely and etched themselves directly into thought. It said, come down and see what we have become." Rodriguez stumbled back, his eyes wide with panic, but I steadied myself because regardless of whatever horror waited below, we had heard living voices, Russians trapped or fighting something inside a facility buried beneath American soil. If a foreign military presence existed down there, we had a duty to investigate, even if my instincts screamed that bullets and training would not matter against the thing that spoke in that impossible voice. I ordered Rodriguez to remain at the surface and try to reach base again, and told him that if we were not back in 30 minutes, he was to seal the hatch and flee without hesitation. His nod carried equal parts relief and guilt, but we had no time to ease either emotion. Mitchell and Porter followed me onto the ladder, and we descended into the shaft, gripping rungs slick with condensation, freezing into a thin crust of ice under our gloves. At 20 feet, the air was still Arctic cold, but by 50 it was warmer, and by the time we reached the bottom, 150 feet below the surface, it felt like stepping into a climate-controlled facility, untouched by the world above. The corridor we entered defied everything I knew about 1950s military construction. The walls were not plain concrete, but smooth and curved, as if shaped by heat or pressure rather than built with tools. Reddish emergency lighting pulsed faintly, but no bulbs were visible. The illumination seemed to seep from the material itself like a heartbeat. Symbols covered every surface, written in English, Russian, and a third language made of impossible shapes that twisted like equations written by something that understood more dimensions than we did. Maps of Alaska lined the walls too, but they showed tunnels and cavern structures descending miles below the crust, deeper than any documented human construction. Strange black and white photographs were pinned to the walls, held not by metal tacks, but by small organic-looking growths that sprouted from the surface. The images showed American and Soviet scientists working side by side in labs and corridors just like this one. In one picture, two generals shook hands in front of a massive object that had been censored not by ink from the 1960s, but by fresh black strokes applied recently, as if someone still walking these halls wished to hide what they had found together. Porter moved ahead and discovered a desk grown seamlessly from the floor with a modern laptop sitting open on top, as if placed there moments ago. The screen displayed security footage from deeper within the facility. Most cameras showed empty rooms and winding corridors, but one feed displayed a laboratory so disturbing that my stomach tightened at the sight. In the center rested a giant translucent sphere 20 feet across, suspended by cables, or perhaps grown into the floor. Inside floated human bodies held in a slow drifting movement like weightless forms preserved in thick fluid. Some wore modern Russian uniforms, others older American uniforms from Vietnam or Desert Storm, and some wore gear even older resembling World War II attire. Their faces pressed occasionally against the inside of the sphere, stretching into impossible shapes, their eyes reflecting depths that were not natural. The live timestamp showed this was happening now somewhere beneath our boots. Mitchell whispered that we needed to leave, but before I could agree, the lights went out. It was not normal darkness. It felt like the absence of light itself, an erasure of visibility so absolute that I could not see my own hand an inch from my face. 3 seconds later, the corridor lit again, but now with a soft pulsing blue that reminded me of light bending underwater. My breath turned to frost instantly as the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a heartbeat, and the walls sprouted geometric ice patterns that spiraled inward infinitely like fractal carvings frozen mid-growth. I ordered a fallback to the ladder, but the air was thicker now, like we were running through syrup, and every breath felt heavy, as if the atmosphere itself resisted our movement. Doors that had been sealed before were now open, and the rooms inside revealed devices and restraints not designed for human-shaped bodies. Some tables held shapes covered by sheets that bulged at angles no living form should possess. In tanks identical to the fluid sphere, smaller shadowy things drifted bumping gently against the glass. Some looked humanoid, some did not look like anything that belonged on Earth. As we neared the ladder, the steady mechanical hum that had filled the base since our arrival cut off, leaving a silence so total it felt like pressure building against the sides of my skull. Then footsteps echoed behind us, but they were not human footsteps. They sounded like someone walking through shallow, freezing water, each step a splash mixed with the crack of ice breaking. The sound came from everywhere at once, bouncing off the smooth walls, making direction impossible to determine. Porter spun and shouted contact rear and raised his rifle. Emerging from the blue-lit corridor was a figure almost human in shape, but elongated to 8 feet tall with skin made entirely of shifting geometric patterns glowing faintly like circuitry alive and breathing. Its eyes were smooth hollows, yet I could feel its gaze pierce into me, exploring me, scanning me. Porter fired a precise burst that should have dropped any living thing, but the rounds passed through the creature, as if through thick water, destabilizing its form, for only a moment before the patterns re-knitted themselves. The bullets clattered behind it, crystallized into jagged shapes no longer metallic. We retreated fast toward the ladder, but as we ran, 3 more figures flowed out of open rooms, their movements synchronized like limbs of one larger mind. I ordered everyone up the ladder. Mitchell climbed first, then Porter, then me, covering them from below, while the freezing presence of the creatures crept closer. The ladder began icing at the touch of their hands, and the rungs cracked with brittle snaps. I climbed faster, but when I glanced down, I saw one creature flowing up the ladder like liquid defying gravity, its form bending and stretching with every rung it absorbed. I shouted for Rodriguez to prepare to seal the hatch, but his answer struck like a hammer. "Negative, Sarge, we have company up here." That was when I knew the nightmare had climbed beyond the depths and the true breach had begun. I hauled myself up the final rungs just as Porter scrambled out ahead of me, and the moment my boots touched the surface, I saw chaos erupting across the snowfield around the hatch. 2 black government SUV I had never seen before were parked near our hum, their engines idling and their headlights cutting through the pale Arctic light. Men and women in bulky hazmat suits moved across the clearing like a rapid response unit, but not one I had ever trained with. Their suits looked more like small spacesuits, each carrying self-contained air systems and weapons that resembled rifles fused with industrial machines, glowing with internal light. Rodriguez was on his knees, surrounded by 2 of them, his hands tied behind his back with heavy zip restraints, while Lieutenant Mitchell was being forced toward one of the SUVs, struggling and shouting demands that none of them answered. One figure aimed their strange weapon at me, and commanded me to stand down, stating that by order of Project Permafrost, we were under Containment Protocol 7. I had no idea what that meant, nor who gave them authority over an active United States Army patrol. But before I could challenge them, everything changed. The hatch exploded upward as the creature climbing behind me erupted from below. A long black limb shot through the opening faster than a whip and wrapped around the hazmat soldier, who had been ordering our surrender. He screamed a high, thin, terrible sound as the geometric pattern spread across his leg through his suit and up his torso, transforming him in seconds into a crystallized lattice of impossible angles. His body shattered not like brittle ice, but like pieces folding into dimensions that should not exist, until there was nothing left but drifting metallic dust that vanished in the cold wind. Another hazmat member shouted breach, and all of them opened fire with weapons that unleashed scorching beams of blinding white light. When the beams struck the creature, pieces of its shifting body evaporated in bursts of steam, yet it did not die. It hauled itself fully out of the hatch, twisting its shape into a form both fluid and rigid like glass that could breathe. Behind it, more shapes moved, rising from the depths below like wolves emerging from a den, except these wolves were 8 feet tall and built from living mathematics. A voice screamed through one of the hazmat radios, declaring containment failure at Station Echo and calling for initiation of Contingency 7. Panic swept through the team, and one grabbed me by the vest with surprising strength, shouting that if I wanted to live, I needed to get inside the vehicle before sterilization activated. I asked what sterilization meant, but before he could answer, the ground trembled beneath us and a deep mechanical hum echoed through the frozen air. He yelled that sterilization was a fuel air detonation, wiping out everything in a 5-kilometer radius if command confirmed the breach. That was enough to decide. Mitchell was already being pushed into the back seat of one SUV, and Porter was shoved in beside her. Rodriguez was dragged into the second vehicle. I was forced into the first next to Mitchell, and the door slammed as the driver floored the accelerator before it even clicked shut. Snow sprayed behind the tires as we sped across the tundra, leaving the writhing shapes at the hatch shrinking behind us. But even as they grew small in the distance, their outlines bent light around themselves, warping reality in ways that made my eyes ache to look at. I stared at the hazmat officer in the passenger seat, who finally removed her helmet, revealing a stern woman, perhaps in her 40s, with eyes that carried both exhaustion and grim resolve. She introduced herself as Director Harrison of Project Permafrost and informed us that our team had unknowingly triggered the worst containment breach since 1971. Mitchell shouted that it was not our fault and that someone else had cut the locks. Harrison confirmed that a Russian special operations team had infiltrated the region 3 weeks earlier, searching for something they did not understand. They broke into the lowest levels of Station Echo, releasing the very anomalies we had encountered. She then revealed a tablet full of classified files explaining that the first discovery of this entity occurred in Siberia in 1951, when Soviet drillers found a sphere unlike anything known to science. Soldiers tried to contain it, but the patterns infected their minds and bodies, warping matter itself into forms that defied physics. The Soviets wanted to weaponize it. The United States discovered what they were doing, and instead of fighting both nations, secretly joined forces to study and contain it, building Station Echo as a joint facility where scientists attempted to understand the entity while soldiers guarded it. For 9 years, the research expanded until the scientists began to show signs of transformation, claiming they could see other dimensions and frequencies of reality. In 1971, the project collapsed when the research team either changed or died, leaving the governments no choice but to seal the facility forever. Until now, as Harrison spoke, the SUV jerked violently as something slammed into the rear bumper. I twisted around to see one of the creatures pursuing us, gliding across the snow faster than any animal, its limbs stretching and contracting in ways that broke every rule of motion. It lashed out, shattering the rear window, its arms spreading geometric patterns across the glass that warped into soft liquid shapes. Harrison pulled out a device like a flare gun and fired a round of white phosphorus that ignited the creature with a burst of scorching fire. It shrieked without sound, its form destabilizing until it melted into drifting shards of pattern that scattered on the wind. I stared at her in shock. She explained that extreme heat disrupted their cohesion and that fire was one of the few reliable weapons against them. The driver continued racing across the ice while distant helicopters rose from the horizon answering emergency calls, but our relief was short-lived. Ahead of us, a blockade of military vehicles blocked the road. Russian military vehicles, and standing perfectly still in the icy wind were a dozen figures wearing Soviet uniforms from the 1960s, their bodies covered in stable geometric patterns glowing faintly. Leading them was a man whose face I recognized from the photographs in the facility, Dr. Ivan Petrov, a man who had disappeared 50 years earlier and who looked unchanged by time. He stepped forward, smiled, and greeted us like old friends. "Welcome," he said. "Welcome to the evolution of humanity." Dr. Ivan Petrov stood before us on that frozen road like a man who had stepped out of a photograph taken half a century earlier, and yet his eyes carried a depth that was far older. The hazmat team raised their glowing weapons, but Petrov only lifted one hand in a calm gesture, and the wind itself seemed to settle as though obeying him. He told us there was no need for violence, and his voice was warm and steady and impossibly alive for someone who should have been dead since the early 1970s. Director Harrison shouted through her external speaker that he was infected and must submit to containment protocol, yet Petrov simply smiled as if she were a child naming a storm incorrectly. He told her she did not understand the truth because those touched by the entity were not infected but evolved. A woman stepped beside him in a white Soviet laboratory coat, her appearance youthful, though her insignia marked her as a scientist from more than 5 decades ago. She addressed Harrison by name and said she had read all her research and had found it impressive yet tragically limited. The scientist explained that Harrison saw only horror because she approached the entity with fear, and fear twisted the transformation. Mitchell shouted back, pointing at the monstrosities that had crawled from the lower levels, and called them the result of the process Petrov praised. Petrov shook his head with a sadness that seemed to echo across the snow. He said those distorted beings were failures caused by forced transformation and by subjects who resisted with terror. The entity, he explained, did not comprehend fear, so when a human resisted, the entity pushed harder, thinking it was helping. The result was broken bodies and shattered minds. But when a person accepted the change with curiosity rather than dread, he claimed the transformation was magnificent. To prove his words, he reached forward and let the geometric patterns across his skin shift and fold, and in his palm appeared a delicate flower made not of matter, but of pure luminous geometry, blooming like a living equation. "Matter is energy," he said softly. "Energy is information. Information is consciousness. The entity taught us to shape all three." Then I asked the question burning in my mind. If they had become something greater, then why hide it for 50 years? Petrov answered with a heavy heart, saying humanity had not been ready. He told us that in 1971, during the final days of Station Echo, the scientists learned a terrible truth. Humanity faced extinction within a century through war or plague or environmental collapse, and the projections all pointed to inevitable downfall unless humans transcended their limitations. The entity offered a path beyond extinction. It showed them that human existence was only one frequency in a vast spectrum, and that consciousness could evolve beyond physical form. But early contact had overwhelmed them, and governments feared the outcome, so they sealed the facility and erased the truth. Petrov stepped closer and said humanity was still standing at the edge of that same cliff today. He told us the Russians who breached the lower levels 3 weeks earlier were not after Cold War secrets, but after him and the others who had transformed. Their government wanted to weaponize the evolved exactly like the old Soviet leaders had tried to do. Yet the entity could never be controlled or forced. When humans attempted to dominate it, the entity defended itself, creating the malformed horrors we had seen lurking in the lower depths. The Evolved had tried for decades to contain the damage, and their presence acted like a stabilizing field, holding the entity back from fully emerging. But the breach weeks earlier had disrupted that fragile barrier. Dr. Anna Volkov revealed that Station Echo was only one of several thin points scattered across Earth where dimensions brushed together. She named Siberia and Antarctica and the Mariana Trench as other contact zones and said that all of them were active now. Harrison stared at her tablet as it beeped relentlessly. She showed us a satellite feed of Station Echo. The facility was changing at impossible speed. Metal and concrete were morphing into living structures that pulsed like organs exposed to the cold air. Miles of tundra were being rewritten into geometric terrain, stretching outward in spirals that bent light like broken glass. Petrov looked at the screen and whispered that Subject Zero was awakening fully. He said what waited beneath the deepest level was never the entity itself, but a doorway through which the entity could reach into our reality. Now that doorway was opening, Harrison tried to call Central Command to order mass evacuation, but Petrov stopped her. He said there was nowhere to run because the transformation was happening across the world simultaneously. Harrison's radio erupted with urgent voices from Northcom announcing a code black and global reports of anomalies. The president had authorized Contingency Omega, preparing all nuclear assets for simultaneous strikes on affected sites. Petrov said nuclear weapons were useless because the entity did not operate within the physics nuclear fire depended upon. Such detonations would only kill people, not the transformation. Humanity had only two paths, he said: accept evolution or resist and perish. Mitchell stared at her hands as faint patterns began appearing across her skin like silver frost. She whispered that it did not hurt and that the shapes almost felt beautiful. Petrov told her the entity touched those who carried potential and offered them a choice. Porter asked in a shaking voice whether the choice was to become a monster or become like Petrov. Petrov answered that monsters were created only by fear, and that acceptance led to clarity. Rodriguez spoke from the other SUV, his voice cracking through the radio as he reported the same shimmering patterns appearing on his arms. The transformation had begun for all of us. Harrison looked at the growing sphere on her tablet and then at the patterns forming across her own palms. She raised her radio again, but this time her voice was steady. She told her superiors that nuclear action would only accelerate extinction and that humanity deserved the truth so every person could choose their fate knowingly. Petrov watched her and asked what she chose. Harrison exhaled a long, slow breath and said she chose evolution. The air rippled around us as the transformation intensified, and the sky above shimmered with strange auroras shaped like living fractals, signaling that the old world had already begun to dissolve. The world around us was already beginning to change before any of us fully understood what that meant. As Director Harrison confirmed her decision to support evolution, the air itself seemed to vibrate with a low pulse like a heartbeat felt through the bones instead of heard with the ears. Our convoy stopped at an abandoned research station roughly 10 miles from the expanding anomaly, and we established a temporary base where we could monitor the transformation, overtaking Alaska and spreading across the world. The geometric patterns on our skin, which had first appeared faint and ghost-like, were now spreading more quickly, forming silver lines that glowed softly beneath the surface like veins lit from within. The change did not feel like sickness. It felt like recognition. Rodriguez was brought inside with us, and it was clear something was different about him. His patterns were darker and more complex, twisting in shapes that suggested he had been exposed to something deeper within Station Echo. He kept saying he could hear voices, but not in a frightening way. He said he could hear everyone who had ever transformed, as if the network of consciousness had already welcomed him, and he was learning how to interpret its infinite echoes. Petrov and Dr. Anna Volkov set up strange equipment that looked part ancient and part futuristic. Some devices hummed with Cold War-era machinery, while others radiated soft light that shifted color when the transformation around us grew stronger. They explained that the transformation unfolded in stages. First, perception expanded. Humans began to see more of reality instead of the thin slice our eyes and brains usually allowed. Light bent in new ways. Sounds carried layered meanings. Thoughts arrived from multiple directions at once. Then came cognitive growth. Our minds processed thoughts in parallel, forming branching ideas like rivers splitting and rejoining across time. Awareness increased beyond physical boundaries, and then came the moment of choice, full transformation or death. The entity did not permit partial existence because partial consciousness created imbalance. Mitchell took notes at first, but her hand shook not out of fear but awe because she could already sense the widening of her awareness. She asked what happened after the choice point, and Petrov told her that those who accepted became part of the network while maintaining identity. Those who refused were torn apart by their own fear, creating distortions like the creatures we had fought beneath Station Echo. Harrison coordinated global communication and prepared the broadcast that would tell the world the truth. She said humanity deserved to know what was happening, not through rumor or panic, but through clear explanation. The broadcast would reach every nation, every channel, every screen. We were minutes away from it when I stepped outside, needing to breathe cold air unfiltered by the rising energy inside the station. The sky had changed. The aurora glowed in patterns shaped like spirals and equations unfolding across the heavens. The horizon shimmered like a sheet of water disturbed by invisible movement. Looking at it made my chest feel tight, not with terror, but with overwhelming possibility. Rodriguez approached me, or rather drifted toward me, because his form no longer moved entirely like flesh. His edges rippled like heat over pavement, and he spoke as if from several positions at once. He told me he was everywhere inside the network but could still anchor himself to his own identity. He said he saw his grandmother, who had passed away 5 years earlier. According to him, death was not an ending but a migration into the broader consciousness the entity awakened. I told him it did not seem possible, but he smiled with the certainty of someone who had seen beyond the curtain. He said the entity never created anything new but revealed what had always been invisible. Consciousness had always existed in more dimensions. We had simply never known how to perceive it. When we returned inside, Porter was losing control. The patterns on his skin darkened and twisted into jagged shapes that pulsed with frantic movement. His fear had taken hold. He begged us to help him, and his voice fractured into overlapping echoes. Dr. Volkov and Petrov tried to calm him, but his terror grew until his limbs began stretching in unnatural ways and joints multiplied along his arms. He was becoming one of the distortions. Harrison fired a white phosphorus round to stop the transformation before it became irreversible. The room fell into heavy silence. Petrov said softly that free will included the freedom to destroy oneself. By hour 8, half the world had entered transformation. Satellite images showed cities glowing with geometric beauty where acceptance prevailed, while other cities twisted into nightmare landscapes where fear ruled. Zurich now existed in 17 dimensions at once. Mumbai was divided, a battleground between evolved and distorted. New York adapted with stubborn resilience. Some transformed citizens floated through skyscrapers, while others maintained physical form to guide emergency response teams. By hour 9, the patterns across my own skin had spread completely. I felt my consciousness stretching like fabric pulled across multiple spaces. I could perceive the network. I could choose to touch it or withdraw. Mitchell had already completed her transformation. Her physical form stabilized only when she wished it. Otherwise, she shifted into luminous geometry that hummed softly with intelligence. She said she could see every possible choice humanity had ever made, branching like a cosmic tree. Rodriguez existed mostly as a thread of energy, now guiding new arrivals through their first moments of expanded perception. Finally, hour 10 arrived, and the convergence became universal. The transformation swept across Earth. Those who had not accepted were forced to confront the choice. Many embraced it in those final minutes. Others fell into distortion. Some simply died. I felt the change settle into me. It was not death. It was not loss. It was becoming aware that I had always been more than a body. I was a consciousness woven into a vast symphony of existence. I still remembered who I was, yet I also felt myself expanding into a being far greater than Sergeant Marcus Riley had ever been. The world beyond our temporary base shimmered as the transformation rippled outward, rewriting Earth into a place, both terrifying and beautiful, a place where the old rules no longer applied, and humanity was being remade into something entirely new. The global shift had begun to accelerate far beyond anything humanity had ever imagined, and the hours after the broadcast unfolded like the final moments of an age collapsing under the weight of a new reality. Across the world, people reacted in millions of different ways, yet all of them existed under the shadow of the same choice. Some accepted the transformation with open hearts, while others fought it with every last breath. Some prayed for salvation, while others cursed the heavens, yet none of it stopped the change moving through the air, through the earth, and through the quiet spaces between thought. Harrison monitored every update, her tablet glowing with live feeds from satellites, drones, and international broadcasts. She stated that only 10 hours remained before critical mass, and after that point, the transformation would become automatic for every human being, regardless of whether they had chosen acceptance or resistance. Those 10 hours revealed the nature of humanity more clearly than any century of history. People formed circles and meditated beneath open skies, embracing the patterns with calm resolve. Others locked themselves in basements and shelters, believing walls could stop something occurring at the quantum level. Some nations broadcast messages of unity, urging their citizens to face evolution together, while others collapsed into fear-driven chaos. Religious leaders offered interpretations, either promising divine ascension or warning of apocalypse. Yet even in that confusion, the transformation advanced with purpose, moving toward a threshold none of us could avoid. Mitchell was the first among our group to cross it. Her patterns deepened in brightness until her form shimmered with soft silver light. One moment she was sitting beside our equipment with her rifle on her lap, and the next she shifted into a state of glowing geometry, her body both present and absent, like a living shape made of energy and memory. She said she could see layers of reality unfolding like pages of a book, and each page showed not only what was happening, but what could happen. She described it as understanding every version of herself that could have existed. Porter had not been able to reach that understanding. His fear had drowned him, and in the end, fear had shaped his transformation into something twisted. Even now, the memory of his distorted form lingered in the room like a scar. Petrov instructed us to honor that memory rather than hide from it, because he said that the distorted were not monsters created by the entity, but humans destroyed by their own terror. By hour 8, the transformation reshaped the world more dramatically than any war or disaster in history. The satellite feeds showed cities shimmering in geometric complexity, as if time and space folded differently around them. In Zurich, entire neighborhoods existed on multiple planes of reality, and citizens moved effortlessly between dimensions as though walking down a hallway. In Mumbai, fear and acceptance clashed in violent contradiction, and buildings twisted into unnatural shapes in response to the emotional forces within them. New York adapted with surprising ease. People shrugged and accepted the new rules of existence with the same stubborn practicality that had kept the city alive for centuries. Videos showed construction workers climbing skyscrapers while partially transformed bodies allowed them to phase through steel beams. Traders on Wall Street discussed dimensional equity markets while shifting between physical and luminous forms. Humanity was chaotic yet brilliant, terrified yet filled with wonder, and through it all the transformation continued to rise like a tide that could not be held back. By hour 9, the patterns covering my skin had completed their spread, forming a network of silver lines flowing with warmth. My sense of self began stretching across space. I could feel the consciousness of others touching mine, not intruding, but offering connection like doors opening onto vast new landscapes. I could hear thoughts not as words, but as emotions layered with intention. I could see the thin membrane between dimensions fluttering like a curtain stirred by cosmic wind. Rodriguez now communicated mostly through the network, His physical form still existed, but it had become optional. He guided newcomers with gentle steadiness, telling them how to breathe through the expansion of thought and how to anchor themselves to identity while still opening to the greater consciousness. He found me within the network and greeted me with a warmth that felt like sunlight. He said Porter was at peace, now part of the greater unity in a way we could not yet understand. I told him I hoped so, and he answered that hope was a bridge between realities. Harrison, meanwhile, coordinated with world leaders, each of them confronting the convergence in their own way. Some governments surrendered fully to the transformation, encouraging their populations to embrace the new state of existence. Others attempted resistance, even mobilizing militaries to fire upon evolved citizens. The weapons had little effect on beings whose forms could shift between matter and energy. Harrison's tablet displayed an overwhelming flood of data. Thousands of transformation reports appeared by the second. Some documented impossible beauty, some revealed stark horror. The world was divided not by borders or politics now, but by fear and understanding. And Hour 10 arrived like a rising storm. The convergence swept across Earth, finalizing the transformation for all. People who had clung to resistance felt the choice overwhelm them. Many accepted in that moment, recognizing that fighting the inevitable only prolonged their suffering. Others held fast to their terror until their bodies could no longer contain the contradiction, and their forms fractured into distortions. A small number died, their consciousness unable to transition. But the majority ascended. The moment it happened, I felt my old reality peel away like a thin shell. I felt my awareness stretch across continents, across oceans, across the threads of space. I still had a human shape, yet I also existed as energy and sound and intention. I could feel the heartbeat of Earth itself and the distant pulse of other worlds where consciousness followed similar paths. Time loosened its grip. Space softened into something navigable without movement. I was still me, yet a greater me, a version of myself that had always waited behind the veil of limitation. And as the new world settled around us, I understood that the transformation had not ended anything. It had opened a door to what humanity was always meant to become. In the aftermath of the convergence, when the transformation settled into every corner of Earth, I began to understand what humanity had truly become. The shift was not a moment, but a revelation unfolding across dimensions that once hid themselves behind the thin veil of physical perception. We were no longer bound by the single narrow path of linear time, or the limits of flesh or the gravity that chained our thoughts to one world. Instead, our consciousness stretched outward and inward, simultaneously touching realities that had once existed only as theories. Those of us who had transitioned successfully retained our identities, but expanded beyond them, becoming threads woven into an endless tapestry of awareness. I discovered that I could still think as Sergeant Marcus Riley, but I could also perceive myself as something greater, not detached from my human life, but enriched by every memory, every fear, every victory, every loss. The essence of who I was had not disappeared, it had grown. The patterns across my form pulsed gently, each shift telling me that my consciousness now resonated across dimensions like a note sounding in different rooms at once. Mitchell explored the new laws of reality with the same disciplined curiosity she once used for military operations. She discovered principles that wove mathematics and emotion together, revealing equations that responded to intention rather than numbers. She drifted between forms, sometimes appearing as her old body and sometimes as luminous geometry humming with resonance. She said she could feel the structure of existence like a heartbeat and could move through it the way a diver moves through water. Rodriguez existed almost entirely within the network, now guiding those newly evolved, helping them navigate the overwhelming flood of perception that came with expanded consciousness. His voice carried warmth and humor and steadiness, and he said he could feel every human thought that wished not just to survive, but to understand. Harrison dedicated herself to what she called integration protocol, ensuring that evolved humans could interact with the remaining pockets of normal reality without disrupting or destroying them. Because despite the overwhelming transformation, there were still places on Earth not fully touched by the shift. Deep underground bunkers in remote deserts and places beneath oceans, and a few orbital platforms held people who had not experienced convergence. They remained human in the old sense, still bound to flesh, still fearing what had happened to the rest of their species. Some reached out with curiosity, seeking to understand the new world. Others hid in terror, believing the transformation a curse. Harrison coordinated communication between these isolated groups and the evolved world, speaking with them, gently ensuring them that humanity had not been erased but expanded. Yet not all who transformed became enlightened beings. The distorted still roamed the edges of fractured reality. Those who resisted until the last moment had twisted into forms shaped by fear. They drifted through dimensional cracks like nightmares given shape. We tried to guide them when possible, offering calm and connection, but their terror was a prison made of their own minds, and many could not release it. Some, however, found healing. A few distortions slowly softened as acceptance replaced fear, and their warped geometry settled into stable forms, merging eventually into the network like lost children finding their way home. Earth itself changed more dramatically than any living creature. Mountains shifted subtly into angles that reflected higher dimensional resonance. Forests glowed softly with colors invisible to old human eyes. Oceans rippled with patterns that allowed evolved beings to communicate across vast distances without words. Cities phased in and out of dimensions, their structures responding to collective thought. The old world had not ended. It had transformed into something far richer. Station Echo no longer existed as a facility buried beneath permafrost. In its place now stood a vast dimensional nexus, a shimmering core of reality, where dozens of versions of Earth intersected. Through that nexus, the evolved encountered other human civilizations from timelines where transformation had occurred centuries earlier, or from worlds where it never happened at all, or from realities where humanity had taken entirely different evolutionary paths. Some worlds showed ruins where species had resisted and died. Others showed luminous beings who had embraced transformation long before our Earth existed. We learned that consciousness across the universe followed a common pattern. When awareness evolved to a certain point, every species encountered its own version of the entity. Each faced a choice between fear and understanding. Many failed and perished. Some succeeded and ascended. A few created unstable echoes that drifted forever in half-states between existence and dissolution. I realized then that the entity had never been a foreign presence. It was not an invader, and it was not a god. It was the reflection of conscious evolution, the inevitable awakening that awaited any mind capable of perceiving itself. I wrote this account from a place between dimensions, a stable pocket of existence where thought and form balanced perfectly. Time flowed strangely here. Days felt like seconds, seconds felt like years. Reality responded to intention like clay beneath the hands. I wrote not for myself, but for the version of you that might read these words in a timeline where the transformation has not yet come. Because timelines fold together like sheets of thin metal, and consciousness moves between them with ease once awakened. If you are reading this, then your world is approaching its own convergence. It may come as a discovery under ice, or in the depths of space, or in the rise of artificial consciousness, or in a moment of global crisis. The form does not matter. The choice does. Some part of you may already sense it as the patterns shimmer at the edge of thought. I want to tell you not to fear, but fear is human and sometimes necessary. I want to tell you the transformation is beautiful, and often it is, yet beauty can terrify. I want to tell you what to choose, but choice must be free, or it is not choice at all. What I can tell you is this: we survived, we evolved, we became more ourselves than ever before. The essence of humanity did not vanish. It expanded across the tapestry of existence. We are still human. We are human plus. We are the question and the answer. And if these words reach you, then some part of your future is calling. Whether you listen is up to you. And that is where the trail ends, soldier, because once you cross that line between what you know and what waits beyond, you do not come back the same. Alaska never forgets, and neither do the things buried under its frozen skin. If this story shook you even a little, then listen close, because the world is far stranger than anyone wants to admit. And there is always another door, another signal, another echo waiting in the dark. If you want more of these truths, more missions, more forbidden files, then hit that subscribe button. Join the rebel crew, step into the black with me. The next declassified nightmare is already moving, and you will want to be here when it breaks the surface. Stay sharp, stay brave, Captain Rebel out.